The loan documents my brother pushed across the dinner table had my parents' signatures on them. $820,000. What he didn't know was that the predatory company threatening to destroy our family had been targeting me long before they ever found him. And my mentor, the man who built my entire career, had been watching it happen the whole time. The document my brother slid across the dinner table had my parents' signatures on it. $820,000. I looked at his face, then at our parents, then back at the papers. He had no idea that the company threatening to take their home answered directly to me. But let me take you back to where this started. It was a Friday evening in late October, and Atlanta was doing what it does best in the fall, wrapping the city in a slow, golden heat that makes you forget summer ever left. I had been at my desk for 14 hours straight, grinding through a commercial real estate dispute that had been sitting on my caseload for 3 weeks. I was a senior associate at one of the most respected law firms in downtown Atlanta, and long hours weren't just expected. They were the price of admission for someone like me. I was the kind of woman who double-checked contracts before signing birthday cards. 7 years of school, on academic scholarships, part-time jobs, to cover what the scholarships didn't, and every dollar in my savings account earned the hard way, one late night at a time. I had built everything I had from scratch, and I protected it accordingly. So when my phone buzzed at 7:45 and my mother's name lit up the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. My mother, Gloria, a retired middle school science teacher, believed that phone calls after 7 in the evening meant somebody was either in the hospital or in serious trouble. She never called, just to chat at night. So when I heard how quiet her voice was, not tired, quiet, but scared quiet, I told her I'd be there in 40 minutes. The drive from downtown took me south, on the interstate, past the airport lights, and through the residential streets where I grew up. My parents had lived in the same brick house on Delmar Drive in East Point for 31 years. My father, Charles, a retired high school football coach, had built the back porch with his own hands the summer I turned 7. My mother had planted a small apple tree in the backyard the year I started 3rd grade. That house wasn't just a property. It was everything they had ever worked for. I pulled into the driveway just after 8:30 and knew immediately something was wrong. Every light in the living room was blazing, something my father, a man who treated the electricity bill like a personal adversary, never allowed after dinner time. A car I didn't recognize sat along the curb out front, a dark sedan with a small company placard on the dashboard. I couldn't quite read from where I stood. I let myself in with my key. The room felt wrong the moment I crossed the threshold. My father was sitting in his armchair, with his hands folded tight in his lap, the posture of a man holding himself together by sheer will. My mother was perched on the edge of the sofa, a mug of untouched tea in her hands, her eyes finding mine, the second I walked in with a look that was equal parts relief and apology. Then there were the others. My younger brother James was seated on the love seat across from our parents. James was 30 years old, charming, the way people who never quite grew up tend to be charming. Easy smile, easy laugh, always one big idea away from the success he was certain was just around the corner. Beside him sat his girlfriend, Brittany Cole, a 27-year-old woman I had met exactly 4 times. She had the kind of carefully assembled composure that takes real effort to maintain perfect posture, perfectly neutral expression, hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was waiting for a job interview rather than sitting in someone's family living room on a Friday night. Standing at the far end of the room was a man I had never seen before, somewhere in his 40s, wearing a suit expensive enough to signal authority. He introduced himself as a representative from a private lending firm called Pinnacle Private Lending and said he was there to facilitate a conversation about outstanding financial obligations. I set my bag down and looked at my brother. James leaned forward and explained that he had taken out a business loan 8 months ago to fund a recording label venture. The label had not performed as projected. There had been, and here he used a phrase I recognized immediately as rehearsed, unforeseen liquidity challenges. The lender was calling in the full balance. The Pinnacle representative stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the coffee table, sliding it in my direction. I opened it without picking it up. The cover page displayed the total outstanding balance clearly. $820,000. I turned the pages steadily, reading the loan structure, the compounding interest schedule, the penalty clauses. Then I reached the section labeled Collateral and Guarantor Documentation and stopped. Attached behind the loan summary was a notarized power of attorney document, the kind that grants one party legal authority to make financial decisions on behalf of another. At the bottom of the page, on the signature lines designated for the property owners, were two signatures, my parents' names. I studied them carefully. I had seen my father sign his name on property deeds and coaching contracts my entire life. I had watched my mother sign documents with the same looping, deliberate hand she'd had since her teaching days. These signatures were close, but the pressure of the pen, the angle of the letters, the way the ink sat on the page, something was not right. I closed the folder and set it back on the table without a word. Across the room, James leaned back and let out a slow breath, like a man who believed the hardest part of his evening had just passed. The corners of his mouth curved into a small, self-satisfied smile, the look of someone certain the most difficult obstacle had been cleared. He had no idea I had just found the first thread. I kept my face completely still, expression neutral and unreadable, the way I trained myself to look in depositions when the other side revealed something they shouldn't have. I looked up and met my mother's eyes across the room. "I'll need some time to review this properly," I said. Calm, professional, giving away nothing. Nobody in that room knew what I had just seen. I didn't ask permission. I simply picked the folder back up, turned to the first page of the actual loan agreement, and started over from the beginning. The room shifted the moment I did that. My mother set her mug down on the coffee table with a soft ceramic click. My father uncrossed and recrossed his legs. James leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, watching me the way you watch someone handle something fragile that belongs to you. Brittany didn't move at all, which told me more about her than anything she could have said out loud. The Pinnacle representative cleared his throat. "Ms. Wells, the terms are fairly straightforward. Your brother has already walked your parents through the key points this afternoon. What we really need this evening is a signature on the guarantor page, so we can begin structuring a repayment timeline." I turned a page without looking up. If the terms are straightforward, then reading them carefully won't take long. He didn't respond to that. Neither did anyone else. A loan agreement of this size, originated by a private lending firm, operating outside traditional banking channels, was never straightforward. I had spent 8 years tearing apart exactly these kinds of documents on behalf of clients who had signed them without reading them, and spent years trying to dig their way out. The language was dense by design. The penalty clauses were buried 3 sections deep. The compounding interest schedule was presented in a font size that required genuine effort to read in a well-lit room, let alone a family living room on a Friday night. I read every word. The loan principal was listed at $500,000, originated 8 months ago. The interest rate was listed as a fixed annual percentage. But buried in subsection 4 was a separate acceleration clause that allowed Pinnacle to apply a penalty multiplier to the outstanding balance in the event of default. That multiplier, applied to 8 months of missed and partial payments, had ballooned the original $500,000 into the $820,000, now sitting on the cover page. It was a structure designed not to be repaid. It was designed to grow. I set that section aside in my mind and kept moving. The collateral documentation came next. The power of attorney was 4 pages long, notarized, and dated 6 months ago. On its surface, it appeared to be a standard, limited financial power of attorney, granting James the authority to act on my parents' behalf in matters related to, quote, business investment and property management decisions. The language was broad enough to cover almost anything, broad enough specifically to authorize the pledging of residential real estate as loan collateral. I looked up briefly. "Mom, do you remember signing a power of attorney for James 6 months ago?" My mother frowned, pressing her fingers together in her lap. James brought over some paperwork back in the spring. He said it was just so he could handle some banking things for us, while your father was recovering from his knee procedure. We trusted him. I looked at my father, who said nothing, but whose jaw had gone tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the look he got when he realized he had made a mistake he couldn't easily walk back from. I returned to the document. The notary stamp was from a small office supply and shipping store in Decatur. Not a law office, not a bank. A strip mall notary who charged $15 and asked no questions. I photographed that page quietly with my phone before moving on. James shifted on the love seat. Di, look, I know this is a lot to process, but the situation is time-sensitive. The Pinnacle guys have been really patient with us, and if we can just get the guarantor signature tonight, they've agreed to pause the default proceedings and give us a 60-day window to restructure. That's a good deal. That's them working with us. I looked at my brother for a long moment without speaking. He smiled back at me, that easy, familiar smile that had gotten him out of more trouble than it had any right to. Behind the smile, though, his eyes were doing something else entirely. They were watching me too carefully, measuring. What I need, I said evenly, is 48 hours to review this with fresh eyes. The representative straightened up from where he'd been leaning against the doorframe. His accommodating tone from earlier had cooled several degrees. Ms. Wells, I understand the impulse to be thorough, but I want to be transparent with you about where things stand. The default notice was filed this week. I didn't sleep that night. I worked. My penthouse, on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta, had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced north, and on clear nights, you could see the city spread out below, like a circuit board, all lit grids and moving lights, and the quiet hum of a place that never fully went dark. I had always found that view steadying. Tonight, I barely noticed it. I changed out of my work clothes, made a pot of strong coffee, and sat down at my desk with the folder, my laptop, and a fresh legal pad at exactly 11 o'clock. I gave myself one rule for the night: follow every thread until it either led somewhere or went cold. No assumptions, no conclusions ahead of the evidence. Just the work. I started with Pinnacle Private Lending. The firm's registered business address was listed on the loan documents as a suite number in a commercial office building in Buckhead. I pulled up the building's tenant directory and cross-referenced it against Georgia's Secretary of State Business Registry. The suite number existed. It was a shared mail forwarding service that rented virtual office addresses to companies that wanted a professional-looking location without actually occupying any physical space. Pinnacle had no real office, no lobby, no reception desk, just a mailbox with a street address attached to it. I wrote that down and kept moving. The company had been registered in Georgia 14 months ago, which was 6 months before James took out his loan. The registered agent on file was a law firm in Savannah that specialized in corporate formations, the kind of firm that set up dozens of entities a month for clients they never met in person and asked nothing beyond the filing fee. The ownership structure listed a parent company incorporated in Delaware. I searched the Delaware entity database and found the parent company, but its ownership information was listed as a series of numbered holding trusts, each one pointing to another, like a set of mirrors arranged to reflect nothing but each other. Whoever built Pinnacle had spent real money making it difficult to find. I moved on to the recording label. James had told our parents the loan was for a music venture he had been developing. He had given it a name, a sleek, professional-sounding name that looked legitimate on paper. I searched the name against every relevant registry I had access to. Georgia business filings, federal trademark records, music, industry directories, commercial, licensing databases. Nothing. The label had never been formally registered anywhere. It had no website presence beyond a single placeholder page, with no contact information, and no content beyond a logo. The page had been created 4 months after the loan was originated, which meant it hadn't even existed when James used it to justify borrowing the money. The funds from the loan had been wired to a business checking account, opened in the label's name. I traced the account through the financial records attached to the default notice and found the transaction history. The money had not been invested in studio equipment artist contracts or production costs. It had been transferred out in a series of withdrawals over 6 months, some to vendors I couldn't immediately identify, and a significant portion moved directly into a personal checking account registered to James individually. I sat back and looked at what I had assembled so far. A fake office, a shell company structure designed to obscure ownership, a business venture that existed in name only, and loan proceeds that had flowed straight into personal accounts rather than any legitimate commercial purpose. None of this was the picture of a struggling entrepreneur hit by bad luck. This was a financial structure built to move money in one direction and make it difficult to trace where it went. But the piece that didn't fit yet was Pinnacle itself. Predatory lenders were opportunists, but they weren't careless. A firm sophisticated enough to build that kind of corporate shielding didn't typically extend $800,000 to someone with no verifiable assets and no real business. There had to be more to the relationship between Pinnacle and my brother than a lender stumbling across a desperate borrower. I opened a separate search on Pinnacle's corporate filings and started pulling every document attached to the entity annual reports, registered agent updates, any litigation history, any regulatory filings. It took 40 minutes of cross-referencing across multiple databases before I found what I was looking for, buried in a supplemental contractor disclosure attached to a state licensing application. Pinnacle maintained a network of independent contractors. The disclosure listed them by name and engagement date. I scrolled through the list slowly, and then I stopped. Brittany Cole, listed as an independent contractor with Pinnacle Private Lending, engagement start date 26 months ago. I checked the date twice. 26 months ago placed Brittany on Pinnacle's payroll 8 months before she had ever met my brother. According to everything James had told our parents, he and Brittany had been together for 18 months, which meant that when Brittany Cole walked into my brother's life with her easy smile and her careful composure, she was already working for the company that would eventually hold his debt. I wrote the dates down in 2 columns on my legal pad and drew a line connecting them. Then I circled her name. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I glanced at the screen. It was an email notification, no sender name, just a string of randomized characters where the address should have been routed through an encrypted server. I opened it. 4 words and a period. Smart women know when to walk away from cases that don't concern them. I read it once, then again. I set the phone face down on the desk, picked up my coffee, and took a slow sip. Then I turned back to my laptop and kept typing. Whoever sent that message had just made one significant miscalculation. They assumed I was the kind of woman who could be frightened into stopping. They had chosen the wrong person entirely. 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning in East Point was quiet in a way that downtown Atlanta never was. No traffic, no construction noise carrying up from the interstate. Just the sound of sprinklers running somewhere down the block and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog greeting the day. I had not been to bed. I parked in front of the house on Delmar Drive, gathered the empty accordion folder I had brought to collect documents, and walked up the front steps. The morning air had that particular October chill that Atlanta only produces for a few weeks each year. Cool enough to feel like a warning, not yet cold enough to be taken seriously. I rang the bell. My father answered the door in his bathrobe and reading glasses, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked at me the way he always did when I showed up somewhere unexpected, a combination of genuine pleasure and immediate concern, because in our family, unannounced visits before breakfast had never historically meant good news. "Baby girl." He stepped back to let me in. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," I said. "I need to look at your paperwork, Dad. Everything you've signed in the last 2 years." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly and called for my mother. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table, the same round oak table we had eaten every holiday meal at, for as long as I could remember, the one with the small burn mark near the edge from a Thanksgiving candle incident in 2009. My mother poured me a cup of coffee without being asked and sat down across from me with her hands folded on the table, already bracing herself for something she couldn't yet name. I asked them to pull every document they had signed in the past 24 months. Tax returns, insurance renewals, banking correspondence, anything James had brought over for them to sign. My father went to the filing cabinet in the hallway, a heavy 2-drawer unit he had maintained with the same methodical care he brought to everything, and returned with a thick stack of folders. We went through them together, page by page. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be. Homeowners insurance renewals, a refinanced vehicle policy, Medicare supplemental paperwork, a form related to my father's pension disbursement, normal documents for people at their stage of life handled in the normal course of things. And then my father paused, his hand resting on a manila envelope near the bottom of the stack. James brought this over in the spring, he said. Said it was routine stuff. Something about allowing him to handle some banking on our behalf while I was laid up after my knee surgery. He had a whole stack of papers. We signed where he pointed. I took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a copy of the same power of attorney I had photographed the night before, but this was the version my parents had been given to keep. And it was different in one important way. The copy Pinnacle had included in their loan documentation contained the full 4-page document with the broad financial authorization language. The copy James had left with my parents was a single-page summary that described the agreement only as a limited healthcare and banking convenience document. The full scope of what they had actually signed, the part that authorized pledging real property as loan collateral, was not on the version they had been handed. My mother leaned over to look at the page. "That's what I signed," she said. "That one page. James said it was just so he could talk to the bank for your father, without us having to go in person." I set both versions side by side on the table and said nothing for a moment. My father put his reading glasses on and looked at them carefully. His expression moved through confusion and then into something slower and heavier, the expression of a man whose trust has just been shown to him in its exact dimensions and found wanting. "These aren't the same document," he said quietly. "No," I said. "They're not." I picked up my phone and opened the Fulton County Property Records Portal, the same public access database I used regularly in my practice for title searches and lien verifications. I typed in the address of the house on Delmar Drive and waited the few seconds it took for the records to populate. The most recent filing was dated 4 months ago. It was a deed of trust, a lien recorded against the property in favor of Pinnacle Private Lending, securing a loan in the amount of $500,000 executed under the authority of the power of attorney. My parents had signed without understanding what they were actually authorizing. Their fully paid-off home, 31 years of mortgage payments finished. The back porch my father built with his own hands. My mother's apple tree, all of it pledged as collateral for a loan they didn't know existed to cover a debt they had never agreed to carry. I turned my phone so they could see the screen. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My father took his glasses off and set them on the table, and sat very still, the way people sit when their body is trying to absorb something. Their mind hasn't finished processing yet. Neither of them spoke. They reached for each other at the same time. My mother's hand, finding my father's forearm, his hand covering hers, and they stayed like that, standing close together, beside the kitchen table, not moving. I gave them a moment. Then I dialed my brother's number. It rang twice. Then someone answered, but it wasn't James. "Diana." Brittany's voice was smooth and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who had been expecting this call and had already decided how they wanted it to go. "You're a smart woman. Smart women know when to walk away." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and looked at my parents, standing together in their kitchen, two people who had spent their entire lives building something honest, now holding each other in silence while the floor shifted beneath them. I placed my phone face down on the table. I reached over and put my hand briefly over both of theirs. Then I picked up my folder and started making a list of everything I still needed to find. The law firm of Holt and Mercer, occupied the top 4 floors of a glass office tower on Peachtree Street. And on a Saturday afternoon, it had the particular stillness of a place built for noise that had been temporarily drained of it. The security guard at the front desk buzzed me through without comment. He had seen me come in on weekends, often enough that my presence no longer required explanation. The elevator carried me up in silence. The hallway on my floor was dark, except for the emergency exit lights casting a low red glow at either end of the corridor. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I went straight to my office, closed the door behind me, and switched on the lamp at my desk. The small, warm circle it cast felt like the only honest thing in the building. I sat down and pulled open the bottom drawer on the left side of my desk, where I kept the active files I hadn't yet moved to the main document room. Near the back, behind 2 commercial lease disputes and a title defect case, was a thick manila folder with a federal court docket number printed across the tab in my own handwriting. The Pinnacle private lending receivership case. I had been appointed as the court-designated receiver for Pinnacle 3 weeks earlier, assigned by a federal judge overseeing a regulatory enforcement action brought by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The Bureau had flagged Pinnacle after a pattern of predatory lending complaints from borrowers across 3 states' loan structures with deliberately obscured acceleration clauses, collateral agreements obtained through deceptive documentation practices, and interest rate terms that compounded in ways no reasonable borrower could have anticipated from reading the materials provided at signing. As the appointed receiver, my role was to take operational and financial control of Pinnacle's assets, preserve them during the investigation, and prepare a comprehensive report for the court detailing the full scope of the firm's lending activities. I had full legal authority over every loan in Pinnacle's portfolio, every contract, every borrower file, every dollar of outstanding debt they held, including, as of 8 months ago, a loan issued to a recording label registered to my brother. I had known about the receivership case for 3 weeks. I had not known about my brother's connection to it until last night. Those 2 facts, sitting side by side on my legal pad, created a problem I needed to understand completely before I did anything else. I opened the folder and began reading from the beginning. The Bureau's initial complaint was 47 pages long. I had read it twice already when the case was first assigned to me, but I read it again now with different eyes, scanning not just for the regulatory violations, but for the operational structure underneath them. How Pinnacle found its borrowers, how it assessed them, how it moved from initial contact to signed loan documents. The firm did not advertise in any conventional way. It had no public-facing marketing materials, no website with a loan application portal, no presence in the directories where legitimate lending institutions listed themselves. Instead, according to the Bureau's findings, Pinnacle operated through a referral network, a system of independent contractors who identified prospective borrowers and facilitated introductions between those borrowers and Pinnacle's lending team. I thought about the name I had found on the contractor disclosure list at 3 o'clock that morning. I kept reading. 40 pages in, I found a supplemental exhibit that had been filed under seal and later partially released during discovery, a working document from Pinnacle's internal loan origination system. It was a spreadsheet listing active and prospective borrowers organized by loan status and flagged according to an internal classification system I didn't immediately recognize. Most entries carried standard status markers: approved, pending, in default, referred. But a small number of entries were marked differently. They carried a designation I had not seen in the Bureau's complaint summary. The notation read HVC, and in the column adjacent to it, a brief descriptor had been typed in for each flagged account. I found my brother's name on page 3 of the exhibit: James A. Wells. Loan status: active default. Collateral: residential property, East Point, Georgia. And in the HVC descriptor column, 4 words that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped 10 degrees. High value connection, legal. I read it 3 times. High value connection. not a reference to James's financial profile. He had no assets worth targeting beyond the home he had pledged through our parents' power of attorney. The notation wasn't about him at all. It was about who he was connected to. Legal, one word, but in the context of a federal receivership proceeding, it pointed in exactly one direction. I pulled the receivership appointment order from the back of the folder and checked the date. I had been formally appointed as Pinnacle's receiver 19 days ago. The HVC notation on my brother's file was dated 4 months before that, around the same time the lien had been recorded against my parents' home in Fulton County. They had flagged my brother before I was even assigned to the case, which meant someone had anticipated or arranged that I would eventually be the person sitting across from Pinnacle's loan portfolio with legal authority over it. Someone had connected those two dots, my brother's financial vulnerability and my professional trajectory, before any of this became visible to me. I set the folder down on my desk and looked out through the window at the Atlanta skyline. The city was still out there, indifferent and glittering, doing what cities do on Saturday afternoons, while the people inside them worked through things that couldn't wait until Monday. A receiver has full authority over every debt in a firm's portfolio. That authority could be used to press hard on borrowers, accelerate collections, trigger foreclosures. Or it could be used to do the opposite, to restructure, to void, to release. In the wrong hands, or in hands that could be pressured into the wrong decisions, that authority was worth a great deal to the people on the other side of those loans. They hadn't stumbled onto my brother by accident. They had gone looking for him. But why? And who had told them exactly where to look? I stayed at my desk without moving for a long moment, the city lights blurring slightly at the edges of my vision. Whatever I had walked into on Friday evening was considerably larger than a family debt problem. And somewhere in this building, or connected to it, was the person who had built the trap. I was still at my desk when my phone rang at 8 o'clock that evening. The name on the screen was Richard Holt, the founding partner of the firm, the man who had hired me 8 years ago, straight out of law school, and had been the closest thing I had to a professional mentor for every year since. I had worked more Saturday evenings than I could count in this building, and Richard had always had an instinct for knowing when people were in the office. Some of the junior associates found it unsettling. I had always taken it as the mark of someone who genuinely cared about his firm. I answered on the second ring. Diana. His voice had the same quality it always did, measured, warm, the voice of a man accustomed to putting people at ease in difficult rooms. I heard you badged in this afternoon. Everything all right? Fine, I said. Just catching up on some things. On a Saturday evening, a small pause, the kind that sounded like concern. The Pinnacle receivership keeping you busy. I kept my voice neutral. Among other things, nothing I can't manage. Good. Another pause. That case is an important one, Diana. High visibility. The kind of work that gets noticed by the right people. I want to make sure you have everything you need. He said it the way he said most things, smoothly, without edges, like a stone that had been in a river long enough to lose all its rough surfaces. Don't hesitate to reach out over the weekend if anything comes up. I told him I appreciated it. We said goodnight. I set the phone down on my desk. For a moment, I didn't move. Richard Holt had been practicing law for 35 years. In that time, he had built Holt and Mercer from a 2-person operation into one of the most respected commercial litigation firms in Atlanta. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of every associate's family members, who sent handwritten notes when clients went through difficult personal situations, who had argued cases before federal appellate courts and won more often than he lost. He had a reputation that most lawyers spent entire careers trying to build and never quite reached. He had also, in the 8 years I had worked for him, never once called me on a weekend evening to ask whether a specific active case was keeping me busy unless he already knew the answer. I looked at my phone for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop. The Delaware corporate registry search I had run earlier on Pinnacle's ownership structure had taken me through 2 layers of shell companies before the trail went cold at a series of numbered holding trusts. I had noted the trust numbers and moved on. Now I went back. It took 40 minutes and 3 separate legal database subscriptions to get where I needed to go. Numbered trusts in Delaware were designed to be difficult to trace. That was the entire point of using them. But they weren't impossible to trace, particularly when the underlying assets connected to them had been disclosed in other filings. A trust that held equity in a regulated lending entity was required under certain federal disclosure rules to identify its beneficial owner in filings made with financial regulators. Filings that weren't always easy to find, but that existed in the public record if you knew where to look. I found the beneficial owner disclosure in a supplemental attachment to a state lending license renewal filed 18 months ago. The trust, holding 12% of Pinnacle Private Lending's equity, was registered to a beneficial owner whose name I recognized without any difficulty at all. Richard James Holt. I sat with that for a moment without writing anything down. 12% was not a controlling stake. It was not the position of someone running the operation. But it was enough to constitute a material financial interest, the kind of interest that under the professional conduct rules governing attorneys created an absolute obligation to disclose and recuse when that entity became the subject of legal proceedings in which the attorney was involved. Richard had said nothing when the Pinnacle receivership was assigned to me. He had reviewed the case assignment himself. All significant federal appointments came through the founding partners before being delegated. He had handed me the file personally 3 weeks ago with a comment about high visibility and career advancement. He had known at that moment that he held equity in the company I was being asked to oversee as an officer of the court, and he had said nothing. I went back into the receivership file and pulled the correspondence log, a record of all written communications between the firm and the federal court during the appointment process. Near the beginning of the log, 6 months before the formal court appointment, was a letter I had not previously focused on. It was a letter of recommendation submitted to the court's receiver selection panel, suggesting Diana Wells as a particularly well-qualified candidate for the Pinnacle appointment. The letter was signed by Richard Holt. He had recommended me for the role 6 months before the court made it official. 6 months before I was told about the case. At a time when, according to the HVC notation in Pinnacle's own internal files, my brother had already been identified and flagged as a high-value connection. The sequence assembled itself in my mind with the cold clarity of a closing argument. Richard held equity in Pinnacle. Richard recommended me for the receivership. Pinnacle flagged my brother as leverage. If I could be pressured into handling the receivership in ways that protected Pinnacle's assets, or if the conflict of interest could be used to remove me from the case at a strategically damaging moment, Richard's investment was protected either way. I had spent 8 years in this building, learning from this man. I had taken every piece of advice he had ever offered me seriously. I had trusted his judgment on cases, on clients, on the shape of my own career. I had believed, without ever questioning it, that his investment in my development was what it appeared to be. 8 years. He had been building me up for 8 years, and I had never once considered that he might be building a weapon, one he intended to point directly at me. I closed my laptop. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent. Continuous. Lit up against a sky that had gone fully dark, while I sat here, taking apart the last 8 years of my professional life and finding something I couldn't unfind at the center of them. I didn't turn the lamp back on. I just sat there in the dark for a while, with the city on one side of the glass and everything I now knew on the other. The drive from Peachtree Street to my building in Midtown took 11 minutes on a Saturday night with no traffic. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, focusing on the numbers, the way you focus on something small and neutral when the larger thing pressing against the inside of your chest is too big to look at directly. I let myself into my apartment, set my bag on the kitchen counter, and sat down at my desk, out of pure habit. I opened the next file on my active caseload, a commercial lease dispute that had nothing to do with any of this, and stared at the first page for a long time without reading a single word. I closed it. I went to the window instead. From the 14th floor, Atlanta at night had a particular kind of beauty that I had always found useful, the way the city's lights spread out in every direction, constant and indifferent, a reminder that the world was very large, and whatever was happening inside this apartment was in the grand scale of things one small piece of it. I had stood at this window through difficult cases before, through professional setbacks and long stretches of exhaustion, and the particular loneliness that comes with building a life almost entirely alone. The view had always helped. Tonight it just looked like a lot of lights. I stood there and let myself take stock of where things actually stood. My brother had borrowed money he had no means to repay from a firm that had targeted him deliberately. The woman he had brought into his life, and by extension into our family's life, had been connected to that firm for more than 2 years before she ever met him. She had not stumbled into this situation. She had been placed in it. My parents, too, people who had spent their entire lives doing everything right, had signed documents they didn't understand, and were now weeks away from losing the home they had spent 3 decades building. And the man who had shaped my entire professional career, who had sat across from me at this firm's conference table more times than I could count, and told me that the law existed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, had used my name, my position, and my trajectory as pieces in an arrangement designed to serve his own financial interests. All of it had happened. All of it was real. And all of it had landed on a Friday evening that had started as an ordinary end to an ordinary week. I pressed my forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window and closed my eyes. A memory came without invitation. James, at 10 years old, sitting on the back porch steps, the ones my father had built the summer I turned 7, watching me pack my bag for a weekend academic competition 2 hours away. I was 17 already, thinking about college applications, already carrying the particular focused intensity that would either define me or exhaust me, depending on the year. James had looked up from the porch steps with that gap-toothed smile he had at that age and said without any self-consciousness at all, "I want to be like you someday, Di." I had laughed and told him to do his homework. Another memory sharper. The day I found out I had been accepted to Harvard Law School. I was 22 years old, standing in the kitchen of my apartment, near campus, reading the letter on my phone, with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. I had called home immediately. My father answered, and when I told him, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sound I had never heard from him before and have not heard since. Charles Wells, a man who had coached 17-year-old boys through losses and injuries and personal setbacks for 30 years without once losing his composure on a sideline, was crying, quietly, the way men of his generation cried when they didn't want you to know they were doing it. "That's my girl," he said. Just that. 3 words. I opened my eyes and looked at the city. The question in front of me was not complicated to understand. It was only complicated to answer honestly. I could walk away from the receivership case. I could cite the conflict of interest, which was real and documentable, and recuse myself without ever disclosing what I had found in those files. I could let the federal process continue without me find a quiet way to address my brother's debt through private channels and protect what remained of my career at Holt and Mercer by never acknowledging what I knew about the man whose name was on the door. I would lose less. I would be safer. I would wake up on the other side of this with my professional reputation intact and my personal life considerably less complicated. Or I could do the thing I had spent 8 years telling clients was always the right choice, even when it was the most costly one. I stayed at the window for another few minutes, long enough to be certain I wasn't making the decision out of anger or hurt or the raw, unsettled feeling that comes with discovering you have trusted someone more than they deserved. I wanted the decision to come from somewhere steadier than that. When I was sure, I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. I carried the mug back to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop to a blank document. At the top of the page, I typed the words, what I know, what I can prove, what I need. Then I started writing. I had not come this far to walk away. Not from this, not from any of it. The people who had built this situation had counted on me being the kind of person who would calculate the personal cost and choose the safer path. They had looked at everything I had worked for and decided it made me careful enough to be manageable. They had been wrong about that from the beginning. I sent the message at 6:45 Sunday morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. 3 words and a location. Piedmont Park, alone, 1 hour. Don't tell Brittany. I didn't explain. I didn't ask. I had spent enough years negotiating with people who needed to believe they had a choice to know that giving someone too much information before a difficult conversation only gave them time to build walls. James would come because part of him, the part that had grown up in the same house I had at the same kitchen table, under the same roof, would know that when his older sister sent a message like that on a Sunday morning, it was not optional. He was sitting on a bench near the park's main fountain when I arrived. The October air had a low mist running through it, the kind that settled into the grass and softened the edges of everything, the trees, the path, the distant line of the city skyline, visible through the branches. Piedmont Park, on a Sunday morning before 8 o'clock, belonged almost entirely to dog walkers and serious runners, people with somewhere to be and no interest in lingering. Nobody was paying attention to us. James had his hands in the pockets of his jacket and his eyes on the ground. He looked like he hadn't slept well, which under the circumstances seemed about right. I sat down on the bench beside him and didn't say anything for a moment. Let the quiet do some of the work. I don't know what you think you found, he said, finally, still looking at the ground. But whatever it is, it's not what it looks like. Tell me what it looks like, I said. He exhaled slowly. Brittany introduced me to some people, business people. They had capital to deploy, and I had a concept worth developing. It was supposed to be straightforward. He paused. Things got complicated. James, I kept my voice even. I've been a lawyer for 8 years. I have seen a great many things described as straightforward that weren't, and I have never once found that description to be accurate when someone used it to summarize a situation involving $800,000 and a lien on our parents' home. I reached into my bag and placed a single printed page on the bench between us. A summary of the key findings I had assembled over the past 48 hours. Organized the way I would organize evidence for a deposition. Walk me through it from the beginning. The real beginning. He looked at the page. Something moved across his face. The particular expression of a person who has been carrying a version of a story for long enough that letting go of it feels physically difficult. He started talking. It had begun, he said, about 2 years ago. He had met Brittany at a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance. She was poised, well-connected, and had what he described as a serious understanding of how money moved in this city. She had shown interest in him early, which he acknowledged now, in the gray morning light, had probably been the point. Over the following months, she had introduced him to people she described as private investors, looking for emerging talent in the entertainment space. The meetings were polished. The conversations were encouraging. By the time the loan paperwork appeared, it had all felt like the natural next step in something that had been building organically. He had not known, he said, that Brittany had any prior connection to the firm providing the funding. She had presented herself as someone doing him a favor by making the introduction. Nothing in how she behaved suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be. I watched his face as he said it. I had cross-examined enough witnesses to know the difference between someone constructing a story and someone dismantling one they had been living inside. James was doing the latter. The details were coming out in the uneven, slightly ashamed rhythm of a person telling the truth about something they wished were different. When did you realize the recording label wasn't going to work? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Pretty early. A few months in. He looked at his hands. I kept telling myself I could turn it around, that I just needed more time. A pause. I missed the first payment. And Pinnacle was they were not understanding about it. The penalties started stacking up, and I didn't know how to tell anyone. Did Brittany know you were in default? Yes. And what did she say? He pressed his lips together. She said not to worry, that there were ways to restructure things, that she knew people who could help. He shook his head slowly. I didn't ask enough questions about what that meant. I let that sit between us for a moment. She was on Pinnacle's payroll before she met you, I said. She has been working with them for over 2 years. She was not a mutual connection. Who did you a favor, James? She was placed in your path. The color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He stopped. Tried again. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. We sat in silence for a stretch. Somewhere across the park, a dog was barking at something enthusiastically and without resolution. The mist was beginning to lift as the sun climbed higher, burning off slowly the way it does in October, when the warmth hasn't entirely given up yet. When James spoke again, his voice had changed. The defensive edges were gone. What was left was something smaller and considerably more honest. I just wanted to be something die. He was looking at the fountain, not at me. I know how that sounds, but everywhere I went, it was always, you know how it is. You're Diana Wells's brother. You're Charles and Gloria's son. Everyone always already knew what I was, before I could tell them myself. His jaw worked for a moment. I was so tired of being nothing next to you. His voice broke on the last word. He pressed the back of his hand briefly against his mouth and looked away. I sat very still and looked at my brother, 30 years old, shoulders drawn in, crying quietly on a park bench in the Sunday morning mist, and felt the full weight of something I had no clean answer for. For the first time in my life, I didn't know whether to save my brother or let him fall. But I knew one thing. This wasn't over. I left Piedmont Park and drove straight home without stopping. By the time I walked through my front door, the part of me that had been sitting on that bench, weighing impossible questions, had stepped aside, and the part of me that spent its working life building cases had taken over entirely. Grief and clarity are not always mutually exclusive. Sometimes the clearest thinking happens in the immediate aftermath of the hardest moments, when everything has been stripped down to what is actually true and what actually needs to happen next. I had a decision, I had evidence, and I had exactly one move that made sense. I scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in 14 months and placed the call. Marcus Webb picked up on the third ring. He was a supervising special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit based in Atlanta. A quiet, methodical man in his mid-40s who had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where people were lying to him and had learned to wait them out. We had crossed paths on a money laundering case the previous year where my firm had represented a commercial property developer caught in the middle of a federal investigation. Webb had been professional precise, and when the situation called for it, flexible in ways that not every federal agent allowed themselves to be. I had respected him then. I was counting on that now. Diana Wells, he said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement. Marcus, I need a favor, and I need it fast. A brief pause. Talk to me. I laid it out for him in the order that mattered most. The receivership case first, because that established my legal standing. Then the connection to my brother's loan. Then Brittany's position on Pinnacle's contractor payroll. Then Richard Holt's equity stake and his role in recommending me for the appointment. I spoke without interruption for 11 minutes. Webb listened without asking a single question until I finished. Then he said, "How solid is the documentation?" Everything I've described has a paper trail. Delaware registry filings, contractor disclosures, internal correspondence, property records, loan origination documents. None of it is circumstantial. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him thinking. The Pinnacle investigation has been sitting with our white-collar unit for 4 months, he said finally. We've been building from the regulatory side, but we've been short on direct evidence of intent. What you're describing, the contractor network, the targeted borrower scheme that fills in gaps we've been working around." He paused again. "What are you proposing?" I told him the plan was straightforward in structure and required precise execution. I would reach out to my brother and ask him to deliver a message to Brittany that I was prepared to discuss a negotiated resolution and was willing to meet that evening at the firm's offices. The framing would suggest I was looking for a way out, a quiet arrangement that avoided further escalation. For someone who had spent months positioning herself as the architect of a scheme that depended on my compliance or my removal, the idea of me coming to the table voluntarily would be, I assessed, very difficult to resist. Webb asked about my brother's willingness to participate. I told him that James understood the situation clearly now and was prepared to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration during any subsequent proceedings. Webb said he would need that in writing before the evening which I had anticipated. I told him I would have it to him within the hour. We agreed on the logistics. 2 agents positioned inside the conference room suite. Before anyone arrived, the meeting documented in full, Webb himself present in an adjacent room with direct audio. I would conduct the meeting as a legal professional, not as a witness or informant. Everything that happened in that room would happen on the record. After I ended the call, I went back to the receiver file, which I had brought home from the office the night before. I had been through most of it twice now, but there were supplemental exhibits I had not yet reviewed in full attachments that had been filed under the Bureau's Evidence Preservation Order and only partially released to me as receiver. One of those attachments was a forensic summary prepared by the Bureau's financial crimes analysts describing the digital evidence they had been able to recover from Pinnacle's internal systems before the firm's principals became aware of the investigation. The summary referenced in a footnote on the 3rd page a portable encrypted storage device that had been observed in the possession of one of Pinnacle's contractor-level employees during a surveillance operation conducted 8 weeks earlier. The device had not been recovered. Its contents were unknown. The footnote included a physical description, a small drive, dark casing attached to a keychain, and noted that the employee in question had been observed removing it from her bag and consulting it during a meeting with a Pinnacle executive. The analyst's note read possibly used for offline storage of sensitive operational documents. Significance undetermined, pending recovery. The contractor employee referenced in the footnote was identified only by an internal Pinnacle code designation, but the code designation matched the one assigned to the name I had found on the contractor disclosure list 3 nights ago. Brittany had been keeping something offline, something she kept on her person. In the world of financial fraud, people who maintained private, encrypted records of their own operations generally did so for one of 2 reasons: either to protect themselves if things went wrong, or to maintain leverage over the people they were working with, possibly both. Whatever was on that drive, she had decided it was worth carrying with her. That told me it mattered. I texted my brother the message we had agreed on: tell her I'm ready to talk. Tonight, the firm's office. Tell her I want to find a way through this quietly. His reply came within 4 minutes. She said yes. 20 minutes after that, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from a number I recognized as the one Brittany had used when she answered James's phone 2 days earlier. Finally, see you tonight. I read it once, set the phone down on my desk, looked out at the afternoon light settling across the city. She thought she had already won. That was her first mistake. I arrived at the office 90 minutes before anyone else. The weekend security team let me through without comment. I took the elevator up, switched on only the lights in the main conference room, and sat down at the head of the long mahogany table to wait. The overhead lighting in that room was the kind law firms favor: bright, even unforgiving. It left no shadows. Under those lights, everything looked exactly like what it was. I had chosen the room deliberately. Webb and his colleagues had arrived 40 minutes earlier through the building's service entrance and were positioned in the smaller offices off the conference room hallway. The audio equipment was running. I had tested the signal once, received a single, confirming message, and put my phone away. In front of me, one legal pad, one pen, and the Pinnacle loan file. I was dressed in the same dark blazer I wore to federal court appearances, the one that communicated without announcing it that the person wearing it was entirely comfortable in serious rooms. I was settled before they arrived. In any negotiation, that matters. They came in at 8 o'clock. James entered, first hands in his pockets, eyes finding mine immediately, with an expression I read as carefully maintained composure over something considerably less steady underneath. Behind him came the Pinnacle representative, the same man from my parents' living room Friday night. And last, through the door, Brittany. She took the seat directly across from me and settled into it with the ease of someone who considered the situation already resolved. She looked at me the way a person looks at a problem they believe they have already solved. "Diana?" Her tone was cordial. "I think this is the right call. There's no reason this has to be complicated." "I agree," I said. "Let's keep it simple." I opened the loan file. "I'd like to walk through the structure of the original agreement before we discuss resolution options, so everyone in this room has a shared understanding of the documents." I looked at the Pinnacle representative. "You have authority to speak to the terms on behalf of the firm." He nodded. "The loan was originated 8 months ago, extended to a business entity with no prior operating history, no registered assets, no verifiable revenue. The collateral agreement was executed under a power of attorney, whose scope was materially misrepresented to the property owners at signing." I paused. "Accurate? The loan was originated in accordance with Pinnacle's standard underwriting procedures." Standard procedures. I repeated, writing it down. "Including extending substantial capital to entities with no operating history based on collateral obtained through documentation not fully disclosed to the signing parties." Brittany spoke before he could answer. "Diana, relitigating the origination isn't productive. We're here to talk about a path forward." "Of course." I set down my pen. "Walk me through how Pinnacle identifies borrowers for this type of product." A brief pause. Something behind Brittany's expression recalibrated almost imperceptibly. "Pinnacle works through a referral network. Independent contractors who facilitate introductions. Compensated on a per-referral basis. Standard industry structure. And in cases where the referred borrower has strategic value to Pinnacle's broader operational interests, not just financial value, is there an enhanced compensation structure for that kind of referral?" The room went quiet. "I'm not sure what you mean," Brittany said. "I think you are." I kept my voice level. "I think you understood exactly what value the referral represented when you made it. And I think the documentation reflecting that understanding is currently on a portable encrypted storage device you've been keeping on your person for the past several months." I held her gaze. "Would you like to tell me what's on it? Or would you prefer someone else explain it?" For the first time, since walking through that door, something shifted in her eyes. Not fear. The recognition of a person who has just understood that the room they walked into is not the room they thought it was. I looked toward the far end of the conference room and gave a single small nod. The door opened. Webb came through first, followed by 2 colleagues, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this many times. He held up his credentials briefly as he crossed the room. "Brittany Cole, you are under arrest on federal charges, including conspiracy, wire fraud, and predatory lending facilitation. You have the right to remain silent." She did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she looked across the table, directly at me, her composure still present, but thin at the edges. "You set me up," she said. "You set yourself up the moment you went after my family." Webb's colleagues moved to either side of her chair. The Pinnacle representative had gone pale, reaching for his phone, before one of the agents placed a hand quietly on the table in front of him. James was looking at the floor. I gathered my legal pad and the loan file, placed them in my bag, and stood up. The conference room lights were still running at full brightness, illuminating everything exactly as it was. I walked toward the door without hurrying, passing Webb, who gave me a brief professional nod as I went by. In the hallway outside, the building was quiet, and the overhead lights hummed steadily. I kept walking. There was a small conference room at the far end of the hallway, the kind used for one-on-one client meetings, barely large enough for a round table, and 4 chairs with a single frosted glass panel instead of the full glass wall of the main suite. I had used it a handful of times over the years when a conversation needed to happen quietly, away from the open floor plan and the ambient noise of a working firm. I found James standing outside it, his back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, looking at nothing in particular. The hallway was empty now. The sounds from the main conference room, the voices, the movement, the particular charged atmosphere of an arrest in progress had faded behind a set of heavy doors. What remained was the low electrical hum of the building at night and the distant sound of the elevator descending. I opened the door to the small room and gestured toward it without speaking. He went in. I followed and closed the door behind us. We sat down across from each other at the small round table. James had his hands folded in front of him, and I could see the slight unsteadiness in them, the residual tremor of someone whose nervous system had been running on high alert for days and was now, in the sudden absence of immediate crisis, unsure what to do with itself. He was looking at the table rather than at me. He had the appearance of a person waiting for a verdict they already know is coming and have stopped trying to argue against. I didn't rush it. There was a water pitcher on the credenza along the wall. I stood up, poured 2 glasses, set one in front of him, and sat back down. He didn't drink. Neither did I. After a while, I spoke. The cooperation agreement Webb's office is drawing up tonight will cover everything you've provided so far. The information about how the referral introduction was made, the timeline of the loan, the communications you had with Brittany about the default. That cooperation is documented, and it will be considered at every stage of any subsequent proceeding. I kept my voice, even the way I used it, when I needed someone to hear the words rather than the emotion behind them. You are still facing exposure, James. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But the difference between what happens with cooperation and what happens without it is not a small difference. It is the difference between a situation you can eventually come back from and one that defines the rest of your life. He nodded once without looking up. The charges against Brittany and the Pinnacle representative are federal. The investigation will expand. There will be a period of time that is going to be very difficult and very public. I paused. You need to be prepared for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What about Mom and Dad?" I'm addressing the lien through the receivership. The legal basis for voiding it is solid. The power of attorney was obtained through deceptive practices, and the underlying loan contract violated federal lending statutes. It will take some time to work through the court process, but the outcome is not in question. I looked at him steadily. They're not going to lose the house. Something in his shoulders released slightly. Not relief exactly. More like one specific fear setting down its weight. "And the firm?" he asked. "Your job." I had been thinking about this since Saturday night, turning it over in the way you turn over a decision you've already made, but want to be certain about before you say it out loud. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a formal disclosure with the firm's managing partners, detailing Richard Holt's financial interest in Pinnacle and his role in the receivership appointment. The professional conduct rules are unambiguous. That disclosure triggers an automatic review. James looked up for the first time. "That's going to create problems for you." "Yes," I said simply. "It will." He held my gaze for a moment, and in his expression, I saw something I hadn't seen from him in a very long time. Not the easy, deflecting charm he used as a default. Not the defensive posturing of someone trying to manage how they were being perceived, but something quieter and considerably more honest. He looked like he was actually seeing me. Not as the older sister, whose shadow he had spent years trying to step out of, but as a person who was choosing a difficult thing because it was the right thing and paying a real price for it. The room was very still. "Are you going to help me?" he asked. His voice was low. It was not the question of someone looking for rescue. It was the question of someone who genuinely did not know whether they had earned the right to ask. I looked at my brother across the small table, 30 years old, hands no longer trembling, meeting my eyes without flinching. "I'm going to get you the best lawyer I know," I said. "Someone whose only job will be to make sure you come through this with everything the cooperation agreement entitles you to." I held his gaze. "But I can't save you from what you chose, James. Nobody can. That part you're going to have to walk through yourself." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the deliberate weight of someone accepting something real, rather than simply agreeing to make a difficult conversation end. It was a small gesture, but it was different from every other version of James I had watched move through the world in 30 years. There was no angle in it, no performance, just a man sitting with the truth of his own choices and finding perhaps for the first time that he could bear the weight of them without looking for someone else to carry it. I stood up and reached for my jacket from the back of the chair. I put it on, smoothed the lapels, and picked up my bag. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow starts early." I walked out of the small room and into the hallway. The overhead lights cast their steady, even glow across the empty corridor. My footsteps were quiet on the carpet as I moved toward the elevator, and the building held its familiar nighttime silence. Around me, the silence of a place built for work, resting between one day and the next. Monday morning felt different, lighter, like the air before a storm finally breaks. I was in my car before 6 o'clock, heading north on the interstate, while the city was still caught between streetlights and daybreak. The federal courthouse on Spring Street was nearly empty when I arrived at 6:45. My footsteps echoed off the marble floors in the main hallway, clear and steady, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I submitted the emergency receiver motion at the clerk's window on the 4th floor. An emergency motion in a federal receivership proceeding requires specific grounds documented evidence of ongoing harm, imminent risk to protected assets, or active criminal conduct directly connected to the matter before the court. I had all three. The motion was 112 pages long, including exhibits, and it laid out, in precise legal sequence, everything I had assembled over the preceding 72 hours. The predatory structure of Pinnacle's loan origination process, the deceptive documentation practices used to obtain collateral from borrowers who hadn't been given accurate information about what they were signing, the internal targeting system, the HVC designations, the contractor referral network, the deliberate identification of borrowers based on connections to individuals with strategic value to Pinnacle's interests, the evidence of Brittany's role as a contractor placed in proximity to a targeted borrower, the flash drive now in federal custody following the previous evening's arrests, whose contents confirmed the contractor compensation arrangements and documented the targeting strategy in terms that left no room for interpretation. The final section addressed the lien recorded against the property on Delmar Drive. The legal argument was clean. The power of attorney used to authorize the collateral pledge had been obtained through material misrepresentation, rendering the authorization invalid. The underlying loan contract violated multiple provisions of federal predatory lending statutes, making the entire agreement unenforceable. The lien, recorded on the basis of both a defective authorization and an illegal contract, had no valid legal foundation and should be vacated in full. I had written those words carefully, but the house on Delmar Drive was not a citation to me. It was the back porch my father built with his own hands. It was an apple tree in a backyard. It was 31 years of two people doing everything right. Because the motion was filed in connection with an active federal criminal investigation, Pinnacle's principals having been taken into custody the previous evening, the presiding judge's clerk confirmed that the matter would be heard before the close of business. The hearing was at 2 o'clock in courtroom 7. I was in my seat 15 minutes early. The room filled gradually. A court reporter, regulatory agency, attorneys, a bureau representative, and a court-appointed attorney for Pinnacle, sitting alone with the expression of someone doing a job they'd been given on short notice. The judge entered precisely at 2. She reviewed the motion summary for 4 minutes without speaking, asked 2 clarifying questions about the power of attorney documentation, and ruled from the bench without retiring to consider. The lien recorded against the residential property on Delmar Drive was declared void and unenforceable in its entirety. The clerk was directed to file the vacating order with Fulton County within 48 hours. Pinnacle's remaining assets were placed under full receivership freeze pending completion of the federal investigation. The room began to clear. I stayed in my seat. The court reporter packed her equipment. The attorneys filed out. The clerk disappeared through a side door. After a few minutes, I was the only person left in courtroom 7, sitting at the plaintiff's table, in the quiet that follows the end of something significant. I placed my hand flat on the surface of the table. The wood was cool and solid under my palm. I had not let myself breathe, not really, not all the way down, since Friday evening, when I walked into my parents' living room and found a folder with their names on a coffee table. I had moved from one thing to the next, keeping everything contained and functional, and directed forward, because that was the only way through. There had been no space for anything else. Not for the particular grief of watching your brother confess to choices that are going to cost him years. Not for the cold weight of discovering that someone who shaped your professional life had been treating your career as a tool. Not for the simpler, quieter pain of a family that had come apart and would need a long time to find its way back to something livable. The motion was filed. The ruling was made. The house was safe. I sat in the empty courtroom and let the stillness of it reach all the way into the parts I had kept sealed off and functional since Friday night. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light was moving across the city the way it does in October, unhurried, already beginning to angle toward early evening, indifferent to the particular weight of what had just happened in this room. I stayed until I was ready to move again. Then I gathered my briefcase, straightened my jacket, and walked out through the heavy courtroom doors into the marble hallway beyond. There were still things left to do, but for the first time since this began, I knew exactly what they were. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor of Holt & Mercer at 2:17 on a Monday afternoon. I had not called ahead. I had not sent an email, not asked his assistant to schedule time, not done any of the small professional courtesies that Richard himself had drilled into me during my first year at the firm. Always announce yourself, Diana. Respect the other person's time. I remembered that lesson clearly. I had followed it for 8 years. Today was different. His assistant, a young woman named Claire, who had worked the front desk for 3 years, looked up from her monitor when I stepped off the elevator. She started to smile, the reflexive warmth of a colleague, and then something in my expression stopped her. She reached for the phone. "It's all right," I said. "I'll knock myself." I walked past her desk, down the short corridor, lined with framed award certificates and Bar Association plaques, and stopped in front of the door with his name etched in brushed silver. Richard A. Holt, Senior Partner. I knocked twice. Firm, even. A pause, then his voice. "Come in." He was standing when I entered, which told me he had expected this visit. Perhaps not today, perhaps not at this exact hour, but he had known it was coming. Richard Holt did not stand for interruptions. He stood when he was prepared. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from decades of courtroom work. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk in the same unhurried way he had gestured toward chairs during hundreds of mentorship sessions over the years. "Diana, sit down." I sat. He remained standing for a moment, then lowered himself into his own chair. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at me the way I had seen him look at opposing counsel, measuring careful, deciding how much to concede. "I heard the Pinnacle motion was granted this morning," he said. It was. A silence. He nodded slowly, as though he had already rehearsed this conversation and was waiting for his cue. "Diana, I need you to understand something. I never meant for your family to get hurt. I just needed you off the case. I had thought about how I would feel hearing those words. I had imagined anger. I had imagined grief. What I actually felt sitting across from him in that quiet office was clarity. I opened my briefcase and placed a single folder sentence on his desk. "You recommended me for the Pinnacle receivership 6 months before the court appointment," I said. "I have the email you sent to the Pinnacle board. You used the phrase, 'she will not look too closely.'" I tapped the folder. "You were wrong about that." He looked at the folder, but did not open it. "The Delaware Corporate Registry shows your 12% stake in Pinnacle through a shell company called Meridian Capital Advisors, LLC. I placed a second document beside the first. "You had a direct financial interest in the outcome of a case you assigned to me. That is a conflict of interest under Rule 1.7 of the Georgia Rules of Professional Conduct." "Diana, I'm not finished." He closed his mouth. "The Bar Association received my disclosure at 9:14 this morning," I continued. "The firm's ethics board received a separate filing at 9:30. The Department of Justice was already aware of your Pinnacle stake through the federal investigation. They have been aware for approximately 3 weeks." I set a third page on the desk, a printed email chain. "This is correspondence between your personal attorney and a Pinnacle board member discussing how to redirect the receivership away from the loan portfolio before Diana Wells finds anything useful. That email is now part of the federal record." Richard's hands, still folded on the desk, did not move, but something shifted in his face, a small, irreversible settling, like a structure losing its foundation. 35 years, he says it. Quietly. 35 years, I agreed. I was not going to argue with him about the length of what he was losing. I was not going to measure his career against my parents' house, against the months my family had spent terrified, against the 8 years I had spent trusting a man who had decided I was useful, and then, when I became inconvenient, decided to point that usefulness like a weapon against my own family. I closed my briefcase. "The bar's formal review process will take several months," I said. "The federal investigation will take longer. You should retain outside counsel, not anyone from this firm." I stood up. Richard looked at me from across the desk. He looked older than he had when I walked in, not visibly, not in any way anyone else would have noticed, but I had studied this man across conference tables and courtrooms for nearly a decade. I noticed. "Diana," his voice was quieter now, "I built your career. You built a tool," I said. "You did not build me." I picked up my briefcase and walked to the door. My hand rested briefly on the handle, and I turned back one last time. "You taught me that the law protects people who can't protect themselves. I believed you. That's exactly why I became a lawyer." I held his gaze for one full second. "And that's exactly why you failed." I opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and pulled it shut behind me, quietly, carefully, the way you close a chapter that has finally reached its end. I did not look back. The drive from Midtown to East Point took 31 minutes. I had made that drive hundreds of times, and I knew every exit, every lane shift, every stretch where the streetlights came in closer, and the yards got smaller, and the neighborhood started feeling less like a city and more like a place where people actually lived. Tonight, I drove it slowly. For the first time in 8 days, there was nowhere I had to be. The urgency that had lived in my chest since the moment I walked into my parents' house and saw that folder on the kitchen table had finally gone quiet. I pulled onto Delmar Drive just as the evening light was fading. The house sat in the middle of the block, red brick, white shutters, a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that hadn't actually rocked in years. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see the warm, yellow glow of the living room lamp, the one with the slightly crooked shade my father had been meaning to fix for as long as I could remember. I parked at the curb and sat there for a moment, just looking at it. Then I got out and walked up the front path. He opened the door before I knocked. My father was 64 years old and had spent 31 years teaching high school history in Atlanta public schools, and he had the kind of face that had learned over decades of watching teenagers try to hide what they were feeling to read people with quiet precision. He looked at me standing on his front porch, with my briefcase in hand, and he was still for exactly 2 seconds. "We got the house back." I nodded. He stepped forward and put his arms around me, and he held on the way. Fathers hold on when they have been carrying something heavier than they let anyone see. I felt his shoulders shake once, just once, and I understood I was witnessing something I had never seen in 32 years. My father, who had sat dry-eyed in the front row at his own mother's funeral, was crying. I held on tighter. My mother appeared behind him, still holding a dish towel, and she took one look at us and came out onto the porch without a word and wrapped her arms around us both. We stood there in the yellow porch light, the three of us, in front of the house that was still theirs. Nobody said anything. We didn't need to. My father led me around to the back of the house, a little while later, the way he always had, when there was something real to say. The back porch was a narrow wooden platform he had built himself the summer I was 7. He had decided the backyard needed a proper place to sit and watch the evening come in. The wood had been replaced once over the years, but the frame was original. He was quietly proud of that. We sat on the top step in the October dark. He told me he had known something was wrong the moment James put those papers in front of him, not because of the legal language, which had meant nothing to him, but because of the way James had moved too fast, been too casual, hadn't quite met his eyes. He said he signed anyway, because James was his son, and he had wanted to believe him. He said it plainly, without asking me to excuse it. Just said it looking straight ahead, the way my father said the things that cost him something. We talked about James, not about charges or federal proceedings or what came next. We talked about who he had been before any of this, the kid who followed me around the neighborhood on his bicycle, the teenager who taught himself 3 chords on a secondhand guitar and played them constantly and badly, the young man who had wanted something bigger than he could figure out how to build. My father said quietly, "I think he was ashamed of wanting too much." I thought about James on a park bench Sunday morning, crying, telling me he was tired of being nothing next to me. I thought about all the ways a family can love someone and still make them feel like they're always falling short. "Yeah," I said, "I think you're right." The apple tree was still there at the edge of the yard, in the same spot my father had planted it the spring I was in 3rd grade. I had watched him dig that hole on a Saturday morning, following instructions from a library book he had checked out specifically for the occasion. The tree had taken a few years to produce anything worth eating, and I had checked on it impatiently every spring until it finally delivered. It was taller than the back fence, now branches spreading wide, looking like something that had always been there and fully intended to stay. My father followed my gaze. "Was it worth it?" he asked. I looked at the tree. I thought about the folder on the kitchen table 8 days ago, and the courthouse steps that morning, and the quiet click of a door closing on a career that had chosen to betray the law it claimed to serve. I thought about my parents standing together in the yellow porch light. "It was the only thing worth doing, Dad." He nodded slowly, the way he had always nodded, when someone finally said the thing he had been waiting for them to say. We stayed on those back steps for another hour, until my mother called us in for dinner. We went. A week later, I was standing in my office on the 11th floor of Holt and Mercer, and I was putting things into a box. Not quickly. There was no reason to rush. I had submitted my resignation the previous Thursday, a 2-paragraph letter, professional and clean, addressed to the firm's managing partner and copied to HR. No explanations beyond the standard pursuing independent practice. No speeches. No exit interview, which I had politely declined. I had packed 1 box on Thursday and left it in the corner of my office over the weekend, and now it was Monday morning, and I was finishing the rest. The office was small, by senior associate standards, 1 window, facing north, a desk I had never fully customized because some part of me had always understood it wasn't entirely mine. 2 chairs for clients that had held a great many people in difficult moments over the years. I had kept the walls mostly bare except for my diplomas and one framed photograph of the Atlanta skyline taken from a rooftop at night, a gift from a colleague when I made senior associate. I took the photograph down first and wrapped it in a legal pad cover. 8 years was a long time to spend somewhere. I had come to Holt and Mercer at 26 years old, fresh from a federal clerkship, carrying a Harvard law degree, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having worked extremely hard and not yet been tested in the ways that actually matter. Richard had recruited me personally, had called my judge, had taken me to lunch at a restaurant I could not then afford, had told me the firm was interested in lawyers who intended to build something, not just collect a salary. I had believed him. At the time, I had no reason not to. I thought about the cases I had worked during those 8 years. The wrongful foreclosure in Cobb County. A retired postal worker, 67 years old, who had missed 3 mortgage payments after a medical procedure and come home to find the locks changed. We had gotten his house back. I remembered the way he had shaken my hand outside the courthouse, both hands holding on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I had thought about him for days afterward. The elder financial fraud case in Decatur. A woman in her late 70s, whose caretaker had systematically drained her accounts over 14 months. The caretaker had been skilled and patient and had covered the evidence carefully. We had been more patient. I remembered sitting across from that woman at her kitchen table the day the civil judgment came through and watching her understand that someone had seen what happened to her and had decided it was worth the effort to fix. There had been others, dozens of others, over 8 years in a dozen different practice areas. But every single one of them had been filtered through the firm's case intake process, its billing structure, its client, conflict review, its relationships with opposing counsel, its calculations about which cases were worth the resources and which were not. I had been effective inside that framework. I had helped real people with real problems. I did not want to diminish that. What I knew now, standing in this office with a half-filled cardboard box on my desk, was that the framework itself had limits that had never bothered me before because I had never been on the other side of them, had never been the person with a legitimate crisis that didn't fit the intake criteria, the person whose case was technically winnable, but not financially attractive, the person who needed someone to pick up the phone and say, "I see what they did to you, and I am going to do something about it." My parents had needed that person. My brother, in his own deeply complicated way, had needed that person. And I had been the one who showed up, not because the firm assigned me to it, not because there was a billable matter to open, but because it was my family, and there was no one else. That was the thing I kept returning to. I wanted to build something where that answer, there was no one else, became less true. Where the people who got targeted by predatory lenders, by fraudulent loan schemes, by the kind of financial machinery that is specifically engineered to be too complicated for its victims to fight, could find someone who understood exactly what had been done to them and exactly how to undo it. I did not have a name for it yet. I did not have an address, a letterhead, a partner, a lease, or a business plan beyond the outline I had sketched on a legal pad at my kitchen table over the weekend. What I had was a bar license, in good standing, 8 years of litigation experience, a receivership background that gave me an unusually clear view of how predatory lending structures were built, and therefore how they could be dismantled, and the absolute certainty that this was the right thing to do. That felt like enough to start. I reached the diplomas last. The Harvard Law diploma had hung on the wall of every office I had occupied since I passed the bar, my clerkship office, my first associate workspace at the firm, and this one. I had looked at it so many times, it had become part of the background, like the north-facing window, or the hum of the building's ventilation system. I took it off the wall and held it for a moment. I thought about the person I had been the day I received it, sitting in a folding chair in the July heat, holding a rolled certificate and thinking that this was the beginning of everything. I thought about my father in the audience that afternoon, and how my mother had told me afterward that he had held it together through the entire ceremony and then cried in the parking lot. I placed the diploma carefully into the box. I closed the lid. I picked up the box and walked to the door of my office, turned the handle, and stepped into the hallway. The elevator was at the end of the corridor. I pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. Light came in from the lobby below, wide open, ordinary morning light, and I stepped forward into it. 3 months later, I turned a key in a lock that had my name on the door. The sign had arrived 2 days earlier, white lettering on a dark background, clean and unadorned, Wells Legal. The installation crew had mounted it to the left of the entrance at eye level, exactly where I had asked. I had stood in the empty hallway for a long moment after they left, just looking at it. It had felt simultaneously obvious and impossible, the way most things feel when they finally become real after existing only in your head for a long time. The office was on the 3rd floor of a building on West Peachtree Street. Not large, not prestigious, not the kind of address that would impress anyone at a downtown firm dinner. A reception area with 2 chairs and a small table. A conference room that fit 4 people comfortably, and 6 if everyone committed to the idea. My own office at the back, with a window facing south, and a desk I had chosen myself, and a single shelf where I had placed my Harvard diploma, reframed in something simpler than what it had worn at Holton Mercer. I had painted the walls myself over a weekend in January, with help from my mother, who had opinions about the shade of white and had been correct about all of them. I made coffee in the small kitchen off the reception area and sat at my desk and looked at the city coming awake outside my window. West Peachtree in the early morning was unhurried foot traffic, building slowly, the sound of buses and distant construction. The particular quality of winter light in Atlanta that was never quite warm but was always clear. I had one appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock. They arrived at 8:53. I heard the door and came out to the reception area to find an elderly couple standing just inside the entrance, still in their coats, looking at the office, the way people look at places they were not entirely sure would help them, but had come to anyway because there was nowhere else left to go. The man was perhaps 70, broad-shouldered, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun requiring consultation before major decisions. The woman beside him was slightly shorter, her coat buttoned to the collar, holding a manila folder against her chest with both hands. I had seen that folder position before. I recognized what it meant. Documents you had been carrying for weeks that you were afraid to put down, because putting them down felt like letting the problem grow larger. "Mr. and Mrs. Okafor," I said. The man nodded. "That's us. I'm Diana Wells. Come on in." I brought them water, settled them at the conference table, and sat across from them with a fresh legal pad and the intake form my assistant had emailed them the week before. Mrs. Okafor placed the manila folder on the table between us with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something fragile. The feeling that moved through me when I opened it was familiar, that immediate shift into focus, the way a case file reorganizes your attention around what matters and filters out everything else. I had felt it hundreds of times over 8 years, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, something quieter and more certain, like the difference between standing on ground that belongs to someone else and standing on your own. This was mine. The intake form had my name on it. The folder on the table had been brought specifically to me. Whatever I did with what was inside it, whatever I built from the information these 2 people were about to trust me with, would be entirely the result of choices I had made, and a practice I had built for exactly this purpose. I took a breath and turned to the first page. The outcomes arrived in pieces. Over those 3 months, in the way legal outcomes always do not, as dramatic announcements, but as entries in court records, press statements from federal agencies, filings that appeared in databases and were reported briefly, and then moved past. Brittany Cole received an 8-year federal sentence for conspiracy wire fraud and predatory lending facilitation. She had attempted to negotiate a reduced term in exchange for cooperation and had been partially successful. 8 years was less than the prosecutors had initially sought. She would be in her mid-40s when she was released. Pinnacle Private Lending was formally dissolved by court order. Its loan portfolio was distributed among legitimate servicers under federal oversight, with a remediation fund established for borrowers who had been deliberately targeted. The fund was not large enough, as these funds rarely are, but it existed. Richard Holt surrendered his law license to the State Bar of Georgia, pending the outcome of the federal investigation into his role in the Pinnacle scheme. The investigation was ongoing. He had retained outside counsel, as I had suggested. James received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. He had cooperated fully with federal investigators, which had weighed significantly in his favor. He was working now at a youth center in East Point, the same neighborhood where we had grown up a few blocks from the house on Delmar Drive. My mother told me he had started teaching a basic music production workshop on Saturday mornings for teenagers. She told me this in a way that suggested she was watching carefully and hoping quietly, which was, I had come to understand, how my mother loved all of us. I did not know yet what James and I were going to be to each other going forward. I thought that was probably all right. Some things needed time and distance before they could be rebuilt into something honest, and honesty had become the only foundation I was interested in working with. I looked up from the Okafor's folder. They were both watching me, with the particular expression I had seen before in clients who had been through something they couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't experienced it. Equal parts exhaustion, and the fragile, careful thing that comes before trust. Desperate hope is what it was. The hope of people who had run out of other options and had decided one more time to believe that someone might actually be in their corner. I set my pen down. "Tell me everything," I said. "I'm listening." For the first time in longer than I could easily account for, I smiled, not the controlled professional expression I had worn through depositions and courtrooms and conference rooms for the better part of a decade, but the real thing, unguarded and unhurried. Mrs. Okafor looked at her husband. He nodded once, and she began. "I want to talk to you for a moment, not as a lawyer, not as a narrator, walking you through a story, just as someone who has been on the other side of what I just described, and who thinks if you have made it this far, that some part of what happened in that story might not be entirely unfamiliar to you. Because here is what I have come to understand. The most painful betrayals are almost never the ones that come from strangers. Strangers can hurt you. Strangers can take things from you. But the kind of damage that actually reaches you, the kind that keeps you awake at 3 a.m, turning the same moment over and over, trying to find the place where you should have seen it coming, that almost always comes from someone whose name you know, someone who sat at your table, someone whose voice you would recognize in a crowded room. The first lesson I want to leave with you is about the difference between love and leverage. There are people in your life who love you, and there are people in your life who have learned that loving you, or performing love convincingly enough, is the most effective way to access what you have built. These two things can look identical from the outside. They can even feel identical for a long time, because the people who use love as leverage are rarely clumsy about it. They are patient. They invest. They show up at the right moments. They build a history with you that makes it feel disloyal, even cruel, to question their motives. The difference only becomes visible under pressure. Real love, the kind that is actually love and not a long-term strategy, does not ask you to compromise your integrity to prove it. It does not present you with ultimatums dressed as family obligations. It does not show up at your dinner table with a folder full of documents and a deadline, and call that an act of care. When someone who claims to love you requires you to choose between that love and your own sense of right and wrong, they have already told you something important about what their love is actually made of. You are allowed to hear that information. You are allowed to act on it. The second lesson is about the people we decide to trust with our becoming. Most of us have someone like that: a mentor, a teacher, an older colleague, a person who saw something in us before we fully saw it in ourselves, and held that vision up like a mirror until we grew into it. That relationship is one of the most powerful and most vulnerable things a person can carry. Powerful, because genuine mentorship can change the entire trajectory of a life. Vulnerable, because the same access that allows someone to build you up can, in the wrong hands, be used to steer you. Not every mentor who fails you is malicious. Some are simply human flawed, self-interested, operating from their own fears and calculations in ways they may not even fully recognize. But some are deliberate. And the hardest part is not identifying them after the fact. The hardest part is giving yourself permission to look clearly at someone you admire and ask whether their investment in you has always been about you or whether it has been about what you could eventually be made to do. Admiration is not the same as discernment. You can hold both at once. The third lesson is the one I think about most. There is a particular kind of pressure that falls on people who are the first in their family to reach a certain level, the first to finish a certain degree, the first to earn a certain income, the first to move into a certain world that the people who raised them never had access to. It is not always spoken out loud. Sometimes it doesn't need to be. It lives in the way a room gets quiet when you walk in the way certain conversations stop and start around your presence, in the particular weight of being seen as the one who made it, and therefore the one who can fix it. That pressure is real. The love underneath it is often real too. Both things can be true at the same time. But being the one who made it does not make you responsible for every choice every other person in your family has made with their own life. Excellence is not a debt. Achievement is not a blank check that other people are entitled to cash. You can love your family with everything you have and still refuse to be used as a financial instrument by the people who raised you or grew up beside you. Those two things are not in conflict. Loving someone and holding them accountable are not opposites. Sometimes they are exactly the same thing. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you recognized someone in it or recognized yourself, I want you to know that you are not alone in that recognition. These situations are common enough that they have names. They are studied. They are documented. And most importantly, they can be navigated. Not without cost, not without grief, but they can be navigated with your integrity intact. And that matters more than most people will tell you it does. If this story reached you, leave a message below and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if any part of this resonated. This community grows because people like you share what moves them. And every time you pass this along to someone who needs to hear it, you are doing something genuinely useful. If you have not already joined this community, now is a good time. There are more stories coming, stories about people who refused to stay silent, who used what they knew, who built something real out of something broken. Diana Wells built Wells Legal. What are you building?